everyone, in today's video I am going to give you a full review of the L.M. Montgomery Anne of Green Gables series. This will feature all 9 official books in the series. I will give you the plot of each book as well as highlight things that I liked about the book but also really disliked about the book. Just a heads up, in next Saturday's video I will be talking about all of the spin-offs of the Anne of Green Gables series written by L.M. Montgomery and also by other authors. So sit back and grab a snack because this is going to be a very long video. The 6th book in the series is Anne of Ingleside. Anne of Ingleside takes place 7 years after the events in Anne's House of Dreams. The novel opens with Anne spending time in Avonlea due to Gilbert's father dying. Anne and Diana end up going on a picnic and visiting all their old spots that they love to hang out at. And this is the last time in the series that we see Anne with Diana, which is really sad because I love the two of them together. But yeah, they got lives, they're grown up now, they have families. So once Anne and Gilbert return home, we are introduced to their children. We already know James or Jim Blythe, who is now 7 years old. We have Walter, who is now 6. We have the twins, Anne, also known as Nan, and Diana, who is also known as Di. They are aged 7. These twins also look nothing alike. And then we have Shirley, who is 2 years old and is also Susan's pretty much little own baby. Because Anne was actually very sick after she gave birth to Shirley. This book also features a very disagreeable house guest in the form of Gilbert's great aunt, Mary Maria Blythe. She believes that Gilbert and Anne should have no problem taking her in. She feels very lonely after the death of her brother, even though she has a perfectly fine place to stay. She basically overstays her welcome. She's very inconsiderate and rude and cantankerous and just an overall annoying house guest and character. So eventually, about the middle of the novel, Anne actually throws a surprise party for her birthday, and this is what finally gets her to leave after Anne tried absolutely everything to annoy her to get her to leave. It was the surprise birthday party that did it, which Anne thought she was doing something nice. But everybody was relieved when she finally left. So this novel does span the period of about 5 years, during which Anne and Gilbert do have their younger child named Rilla Bertha Blythe, or Rilla for short. She's named after both Marilla Cuthbert, Anne's adoptive mother, aunt, and also Bertha Shirley, which is Anne's biological mother. So in this book, the stories generally follow the adventures of Anne's children. This book should not be called Anne of Ingleside at all. It should be called The Blythe Children of Ingleside because we actually hardly see Anne in this book. She's only merely mentioned. She's not really all that present in the novel, which is super annoying, but we do get to learn a lot more about the Blythe children, what their likes are, what they're like, their personality, and you know, some of the scrapes that they get into. Basically, we hear the different perspectives of each child except for Shirley, the second youngest. For some reason, Shirley isn't really mentioned throughout the books a whole lot, which I don't understand. But basically, at the end of the book, Anne feels like Gilbert has completely lost interest in her, and she fears that their marriage may be on the rocks or something. She feels even more strongly about this when Anne and Gilbert go to a party. At this party, one of Gilbert's old beaux is at, one of his old girlfriends. So yeah, Anne is feeling very insecure and sad, but it turns out Gilbert is just very worried about a patient and their marriage. Nothing is wrong with it. Gilbert still loves Anne very, very much. So all in all, I enjoyed the stories in this book, but I did not appreciate that it switched so drastically from a story that was so focused on Anne to a story that was really focused on the children. It could have been more balanced if Anne was more present in the novel, but she's really kind of a side character in this novel now, which is super frustrating. So basically almost every chapter that you read is written in the perspective of one of Anne's children. So if you are going into this book thinking that you're going to be reading a lot about Anne, you're probably going to be very disappointed, as this ends up being a book mostly about Anne's children and not about Anne herself. Eventually, in the end, I was okay with this book because I still really love the stories. We did get enough of Anne in the novel that she was a part of it. But yeah, this was probably a meh read for me. It was parts of it that I didn't like, which was, you know, focusing less on Anne, and then there's parts of it that I liked, which was the stories in general I did like. So this is pretty much a 3-star read for me. It was okay. It wasn't my favorite in the series. The 7th book in the series is Rainbow Valley. In this book, Anne and Gilbert have been married for 15 years. They return home from Europe with the news that there is a new minister in town. We have the new minister, John Meredith, who is a widow with his 4 children, Jerry, Faith, Una, Carl. They have all moved in next door to Ingleside. So because their father is widowed, their children have not been brought up properly since the death of their mother. Their father is very, very slack in the parenting department, and he's so very focused on his theology that he completely pretty much ignores his children. So these kids, the Meredith kids, end up getting into a lot of trouble, and the people of Glen St. Mary think that they are a bunch of wild children, that for ministers' children they should be behaving much better, and they begin to question whether or not Mr. Meredith is fit to be their minister. So the Blythe children and the Meredith children end up becoming really great friends. They spend many days together in Rainbow Valley playing and having fun. The Meredith children actually end up rescuing a young child who is from Glen St. Mary Harbor, who runs away from her stepmother, and she is basically starving and homeless, but man does she have a mouth on her. This is a Mary Vance character they find. Una eventually finds a home for her with Miss Cornelia Bryant, who is now Miss Elliot. Jem also tries to help the Meredith children by creating what's known as a good conduct club. Basically, if they do something bad, they punish themselves. They think of many different punishments, and the punishing leads to one of the younger boys, Carl, to become very sick with pneumonia after he spends a very wet night in the graveyard for doing something very bad. And then we also have Una. She ends up fasting after she'd done something bad, and she ends up fainting in church. Finally, the clueless John Meredith kind of clues in and realizes that something's going on with his children and he needs to pay attention to them better, which then leads to him thinking that he needs to get himself a wife. So he ends up falling in love with Rosemary West, a woman in her late 30s, but she and her sister Ellen have sworn a pact that they will never get married after both of their parents have died, so that they both will never be alone, which this vow is mostly imposed upon Rosemary by Ellen. So when John proposes to Rosemary, Ellen forbids her to marry John Meredith. So she turns him down, even though she very much wants to marry him. Ellen eventually reunites with her former beau that she had when she was young, and they end up getting married kind of without the permission of Rosemary. Like, it's very lax for her. I think is very hypocritical of her. Considering she would not allow Rosemary to get married to John Meredith. Eventually, Una, she hears her father expressing his love of Rosemary, and Una, she goes to Rosemary and begs her to marry her father, even though she has heard Mary Vance say terrible things about stepmother. She's absolutely terrified of having a stepmother, but Rosemary soon realizes that John Meredith is still in love with her. They end up getting married. That's pretty much how the story ends. So again, I love the stories in this book and, you know, reading about the stories, but I am so disappointed in this book. This book hardly even focuses on the Blythe children. It focuses on a completely separate family now. In the last book, we were kind of getting used to the fact that, okay, we're not seeing much of Anne anymore. This is more focusing on her children. And then we go to this next book, which we think is going to be focusing on her children, but it focuses on the children of a completely different family. So it's really frustrating because we're just expecting it to be focused on the Blythe children when it's focused on the Meredith children. And I mean, some of the stuff those children get into is pretty bad and it's pretty entertaining. It's quite funny, but yeah, just because that this book is centered around the Meredith children, I just didn't like it all that much. And oh my god, that Mary Vance character is the worst character I've ever read about. She is so annoying. Oh my god, she is annoying. The book could have done without her. She is the most stuck up, know-it-all little girl. She puts on airs, she tells so many terrible lies. Oh my god, she's just terrible. She's so annoying and bossy. Oh my god, I hated her. So yeah, there's like pretty much no Anne in this book. Like, it's very sparse on the Anne. We get to see a lot of their maid slash cook, Susan Baker. She's in the story a lot, even more so than Anne and Gilbert, which is kind of frustrating. Also, John Meredith, the minister, he is pretty darn clueless for a minister. He's so wrapped up in his theology that he just doesn't realize that his kids really need him, and it's so frustrating. Like, he's the most clueless, dumb-witted man I've ever read about. And the part about Rosemary and Ellen is quite frustrating because, you know, Rosemary wanted to get married to John Meredith and they have, you know, this pact together, but Ellen ends up breaking it anyways for her own selfish reasons when she was very selfish in the beginning and wouldn't let Rosemary get married because she didn't want to be alone. So I think it's very hypocritical and selfish of her. So yeah, after all the disappointing stuff in this book, this only ended up being like a 2-star to a 2.5-star read for me. Like, it's very low on the list of books that I liked. Like, it's not great. I wish I could have skipped this one altogether. So we now have the 8th book in the series, Rilla of Ingleside. This book focuses on the irresponsible 15-year-old Rilla Blythe right before the Great War breaks out. Rilla, by all accounts, is completely obsessed with parties and wanting to have a good time. She's also quite naive and doesn't really know a lot about the world. So once the war is announced, Jem Blythe and Jerry Meredith promptly enlist, much to the upset of the women around him, especially Anne. She takes it very, very hard. And also Jem's dog, Dog Monday, takes it especially hard when they go to the station to see Jem off. The dog, Dog Monday, actually ends up staying at the station for the entirety of the war, waiting for Jem to come home. Walter, who is of age, does not enlist because of a former illness, but also because he is a little bit scared to go to war. Walter feels like he is a coward for not enlisting. Rilla is secretly happy that Walter does not enlist because she feels like Walter is the only person that truly understands her and the only person she can actually talk to. With Jem gone, Walter, Nan, and Di all off to Redmond College while Shirley attends Queen's College. Rilla is left at home with basically not much to do, so while the war is going on, she takes the initiative to organize meetings for the Junior Red Cross Society. So she is collecting donations for the war effort. While she's collecting donations out on the road, she comes across a house where the mother of a newborn baby has just died. So Rilla very impulsively ends up taking this newborn baby home to raise. And Gilbert tells her that if she wants to raise this baby, she has to do it on her own without the help of her mother or without Susan. Rilla doesn't like babies, and throughout much of this story, she isn't very affectionate towards the child. She eventually calls him James Kitchener after the baby's father, or Jims for short. Throughout the novel, everyone in the Blythe house is very anxious of the war. During this time, Rilla grows much closer to Walter, who some of the townsfolk has labeled as a lazy coward. Walter does eventually enlist, as does Rilla's beau, Kenneth Ford. Before Kenneth goes off to war, he and Rilla have a very passionate love scene where they kiss, and basically Kenneth asks Rilla to promise him that she'll wait for him after the war, which makes them pretty much engaged. Walter, throughout much of the war, composed his poetry, and one of his poems becomes very famous and cherished. It's of equal standard to the poem Flanders Fields. As the war continues, one night they hear Dog Monday cry out very mournfully. The family believes that something has happened to Jem. Instead, they get news that Walter has died in battle. In Walter's last letter, sent before the day he died, he tells Rilla that he no longer fears death and thinks it would be better for him to die on the battlefield than to live the rest of his life with the memories of war, forever spoiling the beauty in life. Rilla gives this last letter from Walter to Una, which she believes Una and Walter were in love. We then see the youngest of the Blythe boys, Shirley, join the Flying Corps. Mary Meredith is wounded, and in early May, Jem is reported wounded and missing following a raid. The Blythes then spend 5 months not knowing what has happened to Jem. They finally get a telegram from Jem detailing that he was taken prisoner in Germany and escaped Holland and is now getting treatment in England. When the war finally ends, the boys finally return home. Mary Vance and Miller Douglas marry. Jem returns and is happily greeted by Dog Monday, the war baby that Rilla rescues. His father returns home, and he now goes to live with his father and his second wife. They also decide to stay in Glen St. Mary, and Rilla is thrilled that she can go and visit the baby whenever she likes. Life resumes. Jem goes back to college as he and Faith cannot marry until his studies are finished. Faith, Nan, and Diana plan to become teachers. Jerry, Carl, and Shirley return to Redmond, and Kenneth Ford, Rilla's beau, still hasn't contacted her nearly 2 months after the war has ended. Eventually, he comes back home, and he and Rilla get married. So much in this book happens. It's a very long book. I think it's probably the most interesting book in the series, considering that we get to see a lot of different perspectives on how people viewed war at the time and what they thought of different opposing sides and whatnot. So it was interesting because I feel like over time you can sometimes lose what other people may have thought about the war and what actually went on. So this is kind of like reading almost a first-hand account of what went on during the First World War. So this story has completely transitioned to where most of the story is focused on Anne's children and definitely not Anne herself. Anne is mentioned during throughout the novel and stuff, but she's really never the center of the novel. She's very much a side character. We even see more from their maid in this book than we see of Anne. Early in the book we see that Rilla is like very immature, but throughout much of the book she definitely matures quick when she takes on the baby and when she raises donations for the Red Cross. We also see Walter really struggle with either going to war and risking his life or staying at home and being called a coward. Eventually he does sign up for war and he becomes a very well-known poet for his war poetry, but ultimately he does die in action, which wounded my heart. Walter is one of my favorite characters. He's my favorite of the Blythe kids. It's so sad to read that he died in action. And we also see the sorrow and the pain with Anne when Jem signs up for war and when Walter dies. It's just really heartbreaking. One of the biggest things that I hated about this book and wished that would have been touched on more is that in the beginning of the book, Rilla mentions that the aunt that she's named after, Rilla, died some years before and she didn't know her much as a child because she was so young. So in this book we know that Marilla has died, but we don't get the details of her death, which I think is so frustrating because with Anne and Marilla being so close, I thought that we would get at least a chapter or maybe a paragraph of Anne and Marilla in like their last moments, or at least attending Marilla's funeral or something like that. So it was really disappointing to see that we didn't get a closing storyline for Anne and Marilla, which I wish Ellen Montgomery would have at least given us a little bit more about Marilla's death. And also, like I mentioned before, Diana is really not mentioned in this book much. The only mention we have of her is when her oldest son goes off to the war. So that's really the only mention we have of Diana. So with all that being said, this is probably like my third or fourth favorite book in the series. I like the stories, but definitely not as much as the others. It was kind of slow paced at times, but it was gripping to, you know, read through these struggles that the family faced during the war and awaiting news. And yeah, it's very sad and heartbreaking. So this would probably like a 3.5 star to 4 star read for me. The 9th book in the series, The Blythes Are Quoted. This is the official last book in the series, even though it was only fully published in 2008. Basically, what happened with this book and why it was published so late is that Ellen Montgomery handed in the manuscript for this book on the day of her death. So it was basically never published until we had the collection of short stories that were published in the 70s, which left out a lot of the poetry and original manuscripts. So it was very fragmented, but until recently it has all been put together and put as one book. This is also probably the biggest book in the series. It's like 500 pages. It's very long. So this book doesn't really follow a plot. It's a collection of short stories, much like Lucy Montgomery's The Chronicles of Avonlea and The Further Chronicles of Avonlea. It's just following the many different characters around Glen St. Mary and Four Winds and the surrounding areas. So the reason this book is called The Blythes Are Quoted is because literally the Blythes are either quoted, mentioned, or a part of the story in some way. Which, to be honest, when people mention the Blythes, like almost on every single page, it gets kind of annoying. But I do like seeing the Blythes as being a part of the story in some way or another. The events in this are kind of cut into, it's stories before the war and then stories after the war, with poetry between every few chapters, which the poetry is either written by Anne in the beginning half of the book, and then in the later half of the book it's poetry that's written by Anne and Walter. And then after Anne reads the poetry to her family, there is following commentary by either Gilbert or Susan Baker or any of the other Blythe kids. It is almost kind of like The Chronicles of Avonlea, but in other ways it's not. I like the stories in this book, obviously, individually, but what I really loved about this book was the commentary at the end, after they read the poems, as we get to learn, especially in the later half of the book, much more about the family's feelings towards the war and what happened during the war. And with Walter's death, we also do get to learn quite a little bit more about the Blythe kids after the war too. We do learn that they have, almost all of them have married, they have children, they have, you know, successful careers and whatnot. So yeah, that was really good to read about. It was a good read. I mean, it's a collection of short stories, so it's kind of hard to rate it unless I rated each and every single short story, which I would sit here forever doing that. So it was quite a solid read for me, so overall it was probably a 4-star read. So I kind of want to give my final thoughts on some things, which I was hoping Montgomery would have tied up more loose ends with some of the characters in these stories, especially with Marilla and her death. I wish we would have gotten like an entire chapter about the funeral or maybe her death or something like that. It's really disappointing that we didn't. I would have liked to know what happened to Davy and Dora. We do know that Anne kind of views Davy as sort of like a half-sibling. So Anne's children do call Davy Uncle Davy, but we really don't know much about that other than he is married and he owns a farm, and that's it. Like, that's all we know about him. And we absolutely know nothing about Dora. We don't know what happens to her. One of the other questions I have is, do Anne and Diana stay friends in the later parts of the novel. We know that Diana is mentioned. I think they still do have correspondence, but they really don't see each other quite often. We don't hear of Diana past the Anne of Ingleside book. Like, there's hardly any mention of her. And then there's like really no mention of the other characters. Mr. Harrison, we know that he ends up remarrying his wife. That's all we know. After Anne of Avonlea, we know nothing about him. Lavender Lewis, we know that she marries Paul Irving's father. They live in Boston. They come back to Summers to Avonlea, but that's about it. We know that Paul Irving grows up and he tries to become a writer, I believe, and that's it. We know that Phil gets married to a minister, Priscilla. I honestly cannot remember what happens to her at all. But we don't hear of Aunt Jimsy or Aunt Jaddy or Aunt Kate. Like, we don't hear much about them. One of them went traveling, I think, or a few of them did. I don't know. And then Catherine Brooke, we know that she wanted to go traveling, but we don't know if she actually does it. And then Elizabeth, it's hinted in Windy Poplars that she ends up becoming a very famous stage actress, but that's all we know. So, I mean, I read the series expecting that maybe Anne would have bumped into Elizabeth at some point, but it doesn't happen. Or maybe she'd be, you know, mentioned in one of the short stories, but again, it doesn't happen. So I just think there's like a lot of loose storylines with some of the characters, which I would have liked to have had tidied up. Just my personal opinion. So yeah, there you have it. I know this video was probably very, very long. My throat is so hoarse from talking for so long. It's so sore. I am glad that I've read the entire Anne of Green Gables series. It's a lot of books. And then it's even longer with the spin-offs, which I will have a video out next Saturday for you guys to watch, featuring all the spin-offs that I read and what I think about them. So in the comments below, I want to know if you have read the Anne of Green Gables series, and if you have, which is your favorite book in the series. Personally, like I said before, mine is Anne's House of Dreams, favorite book of all time, hands down. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Be sure to check me out on Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. The links will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye!